Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and all the esteemed guests here in the hall. Welcome to the Thinker Salon at Long Thai Cultural Foundation. Welcome you all. I'm Jaemin Yang. I used to be a journalist for 5 years. I worked for Commonwealth Magazine and United Daily. I mainly cover finance and social issues. And so now I'm here to learn all the before we dive in, I have a disclosure that I am definitely not an expert of international relations or geopolitics. Like most people, I'm just an average reader of international news, scrolling through those headlines and trying to figure out what's going on this world and perhaps getting a mild headache with it. So here I am to learn, and of course, I will throw some challenging questions to our valuable speaker, and I hope we could all get to understand where we are and what to do next in the future. Today's topic is Taiwan and U.S. grand strategy in the era of Trump and beyond. For over a half century, Taiwan has held a key position in U.S.-Asia strategy, balancing carefully under America's strategic ambiguity. Yet the re-election of Donald Trump has changed so many things and inevitably lead many to question that whether the old US-led liberal international order is on the verge of collapse. So is this global instability merely a reflection of Trump's chaotic character? Or is he a symptom of much deeper structural shift within American politics? So to help us unpack this profound question, we are deeply honored to welcome Professor Thomas Berger. So would you please give him applause?
Thank you.
Welcome here. So Professor Berger earned his PhD of political science from MIT and is currently a professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. He is a leading authority on German and Japanese politics, international relations, and comparative government studies in East Asia. So although he is not a traditional Taiwan specialist, but that is precisely why his perspective is valuable here. In Taiwan, our discussions goes too narrow to focusing only on immediate threats from the mainland China. However, Professor Berger brings a vital long-term comparative framework, and he will share how small to medium powers historically managed to survive, maintain autonomy, and play for time while navigating between competing superpowers. So would you like to say something to our guest?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Lung Ying Tai and the staff here at the foundation for inviting me and for helping make this trip possible. I've been studying East Asian security affairs for a very long time, but this is my first, I'm very ashamed to admit, first time to visit Taiwan. So I'm very much happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to learning from all of you more about what's really going on here on the ground here. I also think it's very important, it's a very kind introduction on your part, Jamie, but it's also very important to simply say I'm simply an irresponsible scholar. I have not been in
No, you're not.
No, irresponsibility is good. Don't take that away from me. I've been a professor. I have not worked in the U.S. government. I have many friends and even students now. I hate to say I'm old enough, but I have students who are now in positions of some responsibility in the U.S. government. But I do not pretend to speak for the U.S. government. All I am is somebody who's been looking at these things for a long time and hope to talk to you a little bit about some of these subjects.
Yeah, so we are going to dive directly to all the questions we've prepared for Professor Berger. So if you have any questions, feel free to just raise your hand, let me know. We don't have a strict format, we just go with the flow. All right, so my first question is, the title of your talk mentions US grand strategy. So I'm really curious that What is grand strategy means?
An excellent question. Grand strategy is a term which was originally created by scholars of international relations to talk about how countries think about their long-term goals and how they achieve those goals. It's used a lot, not only by people and university professors like me, but also many US policymakers, journalists, who have for a long time, many of them in their youth, had to spend time in our classes. It involves trying to identify what is a country's goals, what are the threats to its goals and the opportunities for achieving its goals, and about how it can pursue those through different means: military, diplomatic, economic, foreign aid, and trying to take these different, try to coordinate these different aspects to pursue that goal. Now that sounds very logical. It sounds very easy. In reality, it's anything but. Because often these goals are in tension with one another. For example, the United States vis-a-vis China, we want to, on the one hand, help support Taiwanese independence. We also want to maintain a stable relationship with China. Those are two important goals. There's a tension between them. So how do we balance those goals? We have another problem, which we have different groups, different administrations, different interest groups, different bureaucratic actors who have different ideas about what that really means. And there's, again, pressure. So trying to actually pull off grand strategy is very hard. Now, the other thing which I should mention is that in recent years, the US government and other governments increasingly produce documents. Every administration produces a new grand strategy of the United States. The Trump administration just did this last year. But you should not think that that is necessarily what the real grand strategy of the United States is. These are very much political documents. They give direction. It has a real impact on people in the US government. If you're in the Pentagon, if you're in the State Department, you've got to start talking about that grand strategy. But they change with every administration. They are, as I said, a political document. Every administration wants to say, we're here, we're going to do something new. But what real grand strategy is really a set of longer-term ideas, which come out of our history, our understanding of our history, and there's a consensus, a partial consensus at least, among policymakers. And so it's important to understand that grand strategy is something more complex.
Yeah, I would like to ask, what's in Trump's administration's grand strategy? What's in there? And maybe one or two examples you could give us.
Well, I mean, before we get to Trump, because I mean, I don't want to get to Trump.
You just brought it up, so
well, I did bring it up, but I think before we talk about Trump, we should understand, because again, Trump is a very unusual personality.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to talk about him a bit. But before we talk about what Trump is doing, we should probably talk about what the U.S. has been doing before. What has been U.S. grand? How did we get where we are? Yeah. And lots of this seems obvious, but having talked to both students and a different audience in America, but also to different audiences in Germany and Japan, abroad, it's important to go back to the sort of first principles. What is American grand strategy? Where does it come from? Very short. I'm going to try to keep it short, but like most countries, like most democracies, ordinary Americans really don't think much about foreign affairs. Very much. They're much more concerned about getting jobs. They care about health care. They care about education. It's domestic politics that begins, right? James Carville, who used to be Bill Clinton's advisor, he said, it's the economy, stupid. Okay, if you want to win election, you pay attention to those things. And unless there is a direct threat to a country, foreign policy usually does not become a major issue in domestic politics. Taiwan, of course, faces threats, and so it becomes important. The United States sometimes has faced threats, like after 9/11. I come from New York. I actually, as a young man, watched the World Trade Center getting built. When the World Trade Center went down, we felt threatened. But for the most time, we don't care about it. The United States has rarely been threatened in its history, and so for a long time, American grand strategy was staying outside of world affairs. We want to do trade. We want to we expanded in our own hemisphere. expansion of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. But we didn't want to get involved in European affairs. We did not, especially European affairs. We did not want to become deeply involved in Asian affairs. This approach has been called isolationism. That was the dominant approach for over 100 years in American history. That changed, and it's important to understand why that changed, because this set of ideas, I said, grand strategy also comes from history and our memory of history. It changed after World War II. For 2 times in the first half of the 20th century, the United States tried to stay out of world affairs. We tried to stay away from the rise of Germany before World War I. We tried to stay out of the rise of Germany and Japan again before World War II. That didn't work. Both times, because we had become too big a country by then. We represented then, and we represent now, about 25%, depending on how you want to measure it, global GDP. And both Germany and Japan want to know what a country like the United States is going to do in that conflict. And they came to and the United States became pulled into this conflict by supporting, helping the British, by helping China, the Republic of China, when it was the main government. And the Germans and the Japanese concluded we were a threat, and we got pulled into a conflict at enormous cost to ourselves, to the world, to China, to Europe, but also to us. 100,000 Americans died in the First World War, over 400,000 died in the Second World War. This was a real cost. And so we came to, and I don't usually quote him, but what Lenin, to paraphrase Lenin, right? You may not be interested in world politics, but world politics is interested in you. And after 1945, the Americans decided that we have to be more involved in world affairs, especially in those parts of the world which really could affect, become the source of a threat to us. Western Europe, the big threat then, we saw it coming, was the Soviet Union, the rise of communism. In Asia, in Europe, we built, and in the Middle East, we built alliances. We decided it's more important for us to stay there, and prevent a reemergence of conflict than to stay out. This is the best goal for us, even though it's very expensive. Now, of course, that's about power, military power, economic power. But for Americans, and this is important also to understand for Taiwan, it also has to be about something else. It has to be framed in terms of ideals. It has to be framed in terms of democracy. It has to be framed in terms of human rights. We were not always very consistent with it, But we like to tell the American people we're doing this for the sake of freedom, to bring democracy to the world. We wound up making friends with lots of people who are not always very great Democrats. Syngman Rhee in Korea. Chiang Kai-shek was not always a great defender of human rights in China. Governments, even today, Saudi Arabia and we are rather different on this. But we still believed in the long run, they may be bastards, to quote Truman, but there are bastards. And it's still important for us. These ideals still are very important.
Yeah. So from what I heard is that the United States, they kept intervening all these international affairs is out of the because they hoped to maintain their interest. They throw troops onto maybe onto Vietnam or to maybe they put troops on Japan. It's because they want to maintain their interest, so that those little investment prevent them from a bigger loss.
That's right.
That's right.
That's part of it. That's part of it. There's no doubt that we believe if we leave a conflict. So, for example, after the Cold War ended, so the threat of communism disappeared. And as I mentioned, Bill Clinton, he came and he said, it's the economy, we should stay out of these things. What happened? We had a conflict breakout in Iraq, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and we saw the possibility of a tyrant taking control of the oil resources of the Middle East. Might want to talk about that later if you want, but it's an issue. We saw a North Korean nuclear weapons program, and we became very concerned about what would happen if North Korea developed nuclear weapons. We were worried about the destabilization. We saw in Europe, the wars in Yugoslavia and the driving out of ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of Kosovars, Bosniaks, and people getting killed. And each one of those, at first the United States said we don't want to go there, especially with Yugoslavia. With Kuwait, it was different. But we came to the conclusion, if we stay out of that conflict, let us stay out of a Korean conflict. Let's say the North Koreans get nuclear weapons. They did eventually, but we were concerned it would open up a war on the Korean Peninsula. And then we have a war on the Korean Peninsula, and that will bring in Japan. It will bring in China. It will create a regional war, and it could spread in ways which would be profoundly destructive. And so Bill Clinton, whose advisor I quoted earlier, James Carville, said, it's just economy, stupid. We should focus on these things. That's why he decided we've got to get involved. And that's still the way most Americans have thought about foreign policy. It's a question of maintaining stability in the key parts of the world. We can't go everywhere. We can't go into Rwanda. We can't go to Sudan. It's sad. These are terrible things. More people are being killed right now in Sudan than perhaps any place else in the world. But we can't go everywhere. We cannot be the world's policeman. But when we have conflicts in places like Serbia, like Korea, or possible conflict involving Taiwan, which will involve different powers, then we felt that's been the traditional American strategy based on our understanding of history. It's not just a question of USA, we want to dominate everyone. There are people in the United States who are patriots, right? Not just patriots, but nationalists. But it's a question also of our interest. It's interest of protecting, maintaining world stability, and also, as much as we can, to promote the values that we have wanted. That's been the sort of US grand strategy up to now.
Yeah. So that's my next question. Have you seen any change in the past decade about US grand strategy? And what is it? What's the change about?
This is, of course, part of the question we have here. And what we've had, of course, we've had Donald Trump twice, okay? We had the election of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump does not understand the world this way. Now, some of this has to do with his personality. He is, as I said, a reality TV host. He says he's a businessman. He basically plays a businessman on TV. I come from New York. Lots of people in New York do not think very much of his businessman skills, but he's a very good marketer of himself. He's a very good reality TV star. And people who have been following Trump for a long time, reporters, journalists, even members of his own family, they say he wakes up every day and what he's concerned about is being in the public eye. He wants to play the star, and and as a star, he's still playing that tough businessman that he used to play on TV, on a show called The Apprentice. He's still the man who's making the deal, right? And he wants to show to the world that he's strong, he's smart, and he's going to get the best deal in every situation. He has no interest in strategy. He has no interest, frankly, in human rights. He seems to be happier with Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un from North Korea. What does he call Kim Jong-un when he meets him? He says he's a smart cookie. He's a smart guy. And when his people say do something, they do it. He'd like to be that, I think. Now, that's his approach. And that's how and this creates a tremendous volatility. Now, the other question is this now just one person? Yeah. Is it just the psychology of one man? And, we political scientists, social scientists, we want to understand structures. We want to understand how bigger things lead to the outcome. Individuals matter, but individuals are also a product of a certain situation. Why did an individual person like Donald Trump become president of the United States? And people in Europe have to say, once maybe enacted, twice? Is there something going on with the Americans that we need to understand? We don't know fully the answer, but we do see people not quite like Trump because he's unique, but we are seeing a rise of populist figures. People on the right, far right, people like Nigel Farage from the United Kingdom, head of the Reform Party. Now the largest, if you look at polls, about 25% of British people vote for it. People like Jordan Bardella and Marine Le Pen in France. People like the AfD in Germany. all of them are actually tracking around the same. 20 to 30% of the population is ready to vote for them. Who is voting for them? It is people who feel the system has failed. In some ways, what we have been seeing has failed them. Often they're working class people who used to vote for the Labour Party in Britain, who used to vote for the Democrats in the United States, who used to vote for the Social Democrats in Germany. And they feel that they are falling behind. Their wages have stagnated. They feel that they are powerless. They blame globalization. They blame trade. They blame immigration, which is the human face of globalization. There's also a cultural dimension to this. They feel that they are community. They have an imagined past where things were once healthy. The Germans would say, eine heile Welt. Yeah, there was a healthy world, which we have now lost. Yeah, and they look for figures either on the left, could also be people on the left, yeah, like the Podemos party in Spain, the Left Party, now the Green Party in Great Britain, which is now actually taking a sort of more left-wing populist stance. And they are looking for these leaders who are anti-mainstream leaders. Their main focus is domestic politics, but in terms of foreign policy, they also view the foreign policy, this international order, as the product of a group of elites who have been screwing them, pardon me to use the language,
so you're
screwing them over.
So you're saying that Trump get all those figures.
That's right. He's been a magnet, a very unlikely magnet for this kind of, a billionaire TV star, multiply divorced, right, is being embraced by workers, embraced by, in terms of especially in cultural issues, half of his support comes from the United States, from evangelical Christians. Yeah. These groups from disaffected young men, especially young men in the United States, I think in a number of other countries also feel that they're afloat, adrift. And for a while, they voted for Trump. And so this is it. And this is a structural feature.
Yes. So Trump, although he's at the center of his own show, but he's not alone, right? So who's surrounding him, and what influence do they have on Trump? You're quite right.
I mean, it is chaotic in Washington. There are different groups, different voices in the administration. I would say there are three main groups. Okay, one group is, let's say, the traditionalists, the members of the people who are representative or who still hold on to something like the old American foreign policy. People like the Secretary of State, Mario Rubio, right, who's now moving up a little bit for a little while in the American politics. Some of the more older and more traditional members of the Republican Party in the Congress, people like a Lindsey Graham or a Mitch McConnell, they still want in some version of the old American grand strategy. That's their instinct. A second group, who are quite different from them, is the America Firsters. They are neo-isolationists. In some ways, they want to go back to what their version of the old American grand strategy. The United States should get out of European or reduce its involvement in European affairs, reduce its involvement in East Asian affairs. The East Asians, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Europeans, the members of the European Union, Great Britain, they're rich countries. They should be able to defend themselves. The US will provide them some support, but we're pulling back, and we're going to focus on what's important to us. This is very explicit. People like J.D. Vance, the vice president, or the deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller, openly view the world in this way. And then I guess a third group is there is a group, was a lot of attention paid to them, especially in the first Trump administration, still in the second Trump administration, who are China hawks. What they want is a recalibration of the old American grand strategy. They say we should focus on China as our number one competitor, our threat. We should focus all our energy on that, and let the Europeans deal with their own affairs and get out of the Middle East. Okay, Eldridge Colby, who is the deputy, the defense minister of defense for policy, I guess he's the most prominent voice for that kind of position. You and I were talking about this earlier. Yeah. True confession. Right? And you had this very nice image, which I'm going to steal.
Yeah, so for everyone to understand this kind of three faction fighting each other thing, I think it's better we use a metaphor if we describe the Trump administration as a company, and there are fighting departments, at least 3 fighting departments, and a kind of crazy chairman in the lead. So how would you describe this?
I'm going to build on Jamie's metaphor because I liked it so much, so I'm going to steal it, Jamie, but I'll give you credit in my footnotes if I write about it. So one point is, look, there's a bunch of old guard, the old members of the department, the company who've been around for a long time, and they're just trying to contain, right? They're trying to contain the crazy boss and hope that eventually they can bring things back to normal. That's the Marco Rubios.
Yeah, establishment.
The establishment figure. Yeah. There's another bunch of people, let's call them the finance department. They want to cut costs, right? Focus on our core business. You're going to business school, you told me. Focus on our core business, cut our overseas operations, and focus on that. And then there's a third group, the very aggressive marketing department. They want to focus on our main competitor, China, and meet them, counter them on every bunch. Now, the problem is that the person who's in charge, and he really is in charge, is this crazy president who wakes up every day and has his own agenda. He's interested in enriching himself. He's enriching himself and his family members. These are extraordinary. I've never thought that the United States would be such an openly and blatantly corrupt country. I mean, we used to have corruption, but the way we dealt with it was legalized corruption. This is open and blatant corruption. And then, and play the star. And he will be influenced by whoever he talked to last. It is a very volatile and
speaking of
chaotic situation.
Speaking of Trump getting influenced by someone who talked to, I would like to bring up that he recently has been to Beijing and meet Xi, and after he met Xi, he froze 14 billion weapons to Taiwan, and maybe asking for a bargain on those chips, the chips for AI servers. Yeah, so I'm just curious that how does that composition of his government influence his own decision, or is this just his out of his own will?
Well, I'm afraid that each one right now of these different groups, they're looking for after Trump, right? Marco Rubio hopes to restore something like a Republican restoration when Trump eventually, because Trump is an 80-year-old man, his health does not look that good, and even though he doesn't like to admit it, he's going to have to leave office at the latest after his term. So Rubio's hoping to restore the old approach. But he's got to make nice to Trump. Trump does not tolerate any opposition. He goes berserk. He becomes furious. He has explosions of temper when he's denied. Yeah. J.D. Vance is clearly looking to be the next president and push an America First agenda, a neo-isolationist approach. And then, I don't think that there's anybody who's heading for the presidency who's from the marketing department. Frankly, this get tough on China approach is not the main approach. But there's some people who I think would like to follow that kind of focus on countering the China threat. And we'll see if that might emerge. But those are sort of and each one of them is trying to maneuver. Now that trip to, which we just had in the news, and I'm sure has created a lot of anxiety in Taiwan for good reason. I mean, lots of US allies have been worried about this kind of scenario. The Japanese, for example, have been worried from already the first Trump administration that Trump will trade the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, Diaoyu Islands, for concessions on agriculture, right? Some short-term gain in order to look good on TV. And so we've always been worried about that. He's come to, as you pointed out, to Beijing. I was listening to news reports. Ying Tai was asking me, what did I think? I said, well, it could have been worse. Yeah. Because the first report suggested that, he had resisted, what was it, the 4 demands that China had made, including saying that the U.S. should openly oppose Taiwanese independence and do various types of things along that line. So I thought at least so good, but exactly as you said, and it could have been predicted. He suddenly noticed, oh, China cares about weapon sales. I can use this as a bargaining chip, which it never should have been put on the table this way. Should not have been used this way. Now, this is bad news for Taiwan. The good news is, if there's any good news, is that any promise that Trump makes will be broken. Yeah. They've said now it's a pause. It's not a suspension. I would not be surprised if Trump just as China tries to sell us soybeans over and over again, Trump will try to sell China, right? Pauses on sales over and over again. But it is a good example of how he's influenced by the last person he talks about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm really curious about what about Asia? Like under this kind of scenario, where does Asia and Taiwan fit into this picture? Like in the last Trump's administration and after that, what would happen?
Well, I mean, Asia is, of course, a huge part of the world economy. It is of tremendous importance to the United States. Even after World War II, the United States understood it had to be involved in Asia. The Japanese showed us that they could reach out and touch us. Pearl Harbor, we cannot pretend, right, that Asia could not become a threat. One of my old friends, Mike Green, who used to be on the National Security Council, he wrote a good book on this, and he said the United States already in the 1950s understood that if we allowed a hostile force to dominate East Asia, that could eventually become a threat to us. I think that's how lots of the traditional US defense people understood the situation. We'll talk about Taiwan, I'm sure, in a second. Where does Taiwan fit into this? So we've built relations, very tight security relations with a number of major East Asian countries: Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Philippines is a longtime ally of ours, treaty allies. We've built partnerships with Singapore. We're trying to build, it's also part of Asia, though sometimes it seems very far away from you, India. Yeah, so these are the countries we've been trying to pull together to avoid a potential destabilization of the East Asian region. Those alliances now, and those alliances, unlike Europe, you have NATO. You could imagine a European security cooperation without the United States, which would be able to meet, at least in theory, whatever threat is likely to come from Russia, in theory. Asia is much more difficult. We do not have, and have not, except for a certain period in the 1950s, sought an East Asia NATO. Mm-hmm. It's much too difficult to do, frankly, in my view. Mm-hmm. And so Asia now all of the European countries all the US allies who have come to depend upon us find themselves in a very difficult situation. I think it's especially difficult for Asian countries. And I think what you're seeing is some effort, the Japanese in particular, trying to do what they call A+. Sounds like a very good term paper, but A+ means America Plus. They're trying to keep their relationship with the United States and reach out to other Asian countries, especially South Korea, with Australia, with India, with the Philippines, try to cobble something together. But this will be very difficult.
Compared to all the other countries in Asia, what's Taiwan's value to the US, in your opinion?
The traditional view, and I will confess I'm a traditionalist in this view, is first of all, there are 3 things. Geography, mm-hmm. Okay, geopolitics. Taiwan is in a valuable piece of real estate. Mm-hmm. It is in the middle of what we call the first island chain, the chain of islands, which reach from the Kuril Islands up from the Soviet Union, Russia, down through Japan, through Okinawa, the Ryukyu Islands, to Taiwan, Philippines, into Southeast Asia. That is maritime Southeast Asia. That is also controls the seas. Now, this is the sea lanes of communication. The Chinese Navy understands this also. And so and already before we entered into a strategic competition with China, we understood that Taiwan is right in the center of that chain. It's vital. It is now more vital today than it ever was because much of world trade goes by sea through these waters. So this is a tremendous strategic importance. The second factor, and this is why I mentioned democracy. I mean, Taiwan used to be one of our bastards. It used to be a small authoritarian, relatively small authoritarian outpost. It was a success story in terms of the American vision, the dream that somehow we can help bring not only a balance of power, but a transformation. And what you have done in Taiwan, from my point of view as an outsider, is quite astonishing, quite amazing. You've seen coming out of what was a pretty harsh authoritarian regime, a vibrant democracy. It demonstrates that, for example, we used to debate what prerequisites. Is it possible for Asian countries to become democracies? Well, Taiwan, not only Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, right, have demonstrated it's possible to have Confucian values to be an Asian country and to show that a Chinese country can become democratic. So it's very valuable for that as well. It's the image of what could be a different China. And then, what else? Oh yeah, I mean, of course, what gets a lot in the news, but correctly so, your importance to the global economy, especially to high tech. I mean, what you call now the Silicon Shield. Taiwan, and I'm just amazed looking at the figures. I was speaking to the gentleman from Caixin here. I mean, what is it, 9% growth, 10% economic growth for an advanced industrial country? And it's because you have become a key supplier in semiconductors, in high technology to much of the world. Yeah. And so, for all of these reasons, not any one of them, right? Lots of focus on the Silicon Shield and the economic, that's important. But it's also because of democracy and it's because of where you are. Taiwan is important to us, if not to Donald Trump.
Yeah, but after all of that, here I have a really tough one for you. Like,
okay. Up to now, it's been easy.
Hold your breath. Or maybe, will the U.S. intervene if China attacks? Like,
well, now that is a really tough question.
Yeah.
I already mentioned earlier that for a long time we have different goals in our grand strategy. Our relationship to China is important. Yeah. I mean, if we have to work with China, first of all, to manage our competition. Yeah. China is a major military power. Its military power is increasing. Its nuclear arsenal. China has now made a decision to increase the number of nuclear weapons. They used to have a minimal level. They're now aiming for at least 1,500 nuclear warheads deployed within a decade, less than a decade. We must manage this competition or it will be devastating, not only for Taiwan, but for us. We have to I was talking to someone who's very interested in global warming, global governance issues. We cannot address this question without working with China. So we need to stabilize our relationship with China for a whole bunch of reasons, military, global governance, so forth. At the same time, Taiwan is critical. If we were to give up on Taiwan, okay, so there are different voices in the United States about how we should. So what we've done traditionally, again, is this famous policy of strategic ambiguity, right? On the one hand, we want, and I am not a member of the State Department, there's certain formulas we learn. I'm sure you in this room have heard this formula over and over again. We want the situation in the Taiwan Straits to be resolved peacefully. The US policy towards Taiwan is governed by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 communiques, and the 6, what was it again, assurances. Yeah, some of you are sort of singing it along with me. That's, if you're in the State Department, you learn this. You learn that by heart. That's all to try to, on the one hand, have a stable relationship with China, and on the other hand, to preserve Taiwan, the status quo in Taiwan, as much as that's possible, and that is desirable. Some people in the United States, for example, Richard Haas, who's the head of the American Council of Foreign Relations, former government member. A few years ago, I think he had a big article in the New York Times that said we should get rid of strategic ambiguity. Strategic clarity is what we need. If you attack Taiwan, if there's a military incident, we should intervene. That's a good way to start a war with China. Mm-hmm. That will destabilize one of our key goals. On the other hand, there are some people, Cato Institute, Quincy Institute, they don't say it sometimes that clearly, but they suggest that we should be willing to say, look, Taiwan's not that important. We can back away. I think that's a mistake for us from the US point of view. I'm not talking about the Taiwanese point of view. In the end, you have to decide and you understand your situation, your wants, your needs, your own grand strategy, right? And we will have to adapt to that. But from our point of view, to bargain away Taiwan would be devastating. It would be a geopolitical disaster in terms of breaking the first island chain. All of our allies who depend on us will be more scared than ever before. South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Southeast Asian countries, every one of them will now say, we now have to think again. What will they do? There are two possibilities. Either they decide to try to work out a modus vivendi with China, and then China will become the hegemon, what it says is the natural situation in Asia, or they have to develop the ability to defend themselves. Countries like India, Japan, South Korea, even though it's small, the South Koreans, they're a small country compared to China. They call themselves a shrimp among whales. They've been stuck between Japan, Russia, and China for much of their history, all of their history. But they're a tough shrimp. They will go nuclear, very possibly. And then you may have conflicts with nuclear armed powers in Asia, which would be terrifying. So I think it would be a bad idea to do this.
Yeah.
And so, this is the value of Taiwan.
So
now, Trump doesn't think this.
Yeah, so you're suggesting that traditionally U.S. will intervene, but Trump doesn't think like that.
Well, yeah, U.S. policymakers, the Biden administration was most clear, right, in saying that, a number of interviews, they said, if, right, something happens, China should understand. But then we always walked it back because we want to preserve strategic ambiguity. We don't want to start a war here. And one of my friends, a number of my friends who were in the US government during the Chen Shui-bian period said, don't go this way, right? If you go down this path, we're not sure how we're going to help you, how much we can help you if you're going to start a war in Asia. So, we've played that, that strategic ambiguity, and I think that's been a wise policy. Now, Trump, as you said, he doesn't think this way. Some of the voices around him, they will try to restrain him. They will try to convince him that he shouldn't go this way. There is an example. We've watched something similar happen with Ukraine. Ukraine is not as important to us, by the way, as Taiwan. We have a very different relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan is much more important, frankly, to us and to global geopolitics. But we did commit to Ukraine for good reason, and to provide support in the Ukrainian case. And then Trump comes in, and of course, Trump doesn't care about Ukraine, right? But even though, and Trump was trying to listening to Vladimir Putin, ready to sell out, and we did cut off our aid to Ukraine. We did actually come up with a peace plan which accepted lots of the language which the Russians preferred. And in that particular case, that didn't go any place. The Ukrainians continued to resist. The Europeans stepped up. And the US continued to sell weapons to the Europeans, which they then are giving to Ukraine. We continue to give intelligence support. That is, the ability of the Ukrainians to resist the Russians depends on their ability to understand what the Russians are doing. And that has again been so the United States, even though we abandoned Ukraine, did not completely abandon Ukraine. And one should understand that Trump may be willing to make concessions on Taiwan, but he's not going to give up all his leverage. And so he's probably not going to do that.
But you think under what kind of circumstance will Trump step in? Well,
now, again, you're pushing me on this tough question. And I think, look, if we have a contingency, a scenario, something which happens, We can think about blockade, right? Different kinds of blockade. There could be a non-kinetic, that is a blockade where China simply interferes with communication with Taiwan, doing inspections, for example. You could have a kinetic, a more, right, using military force blockade, an outright invasion, right? So there are different scenarios. How will Trump react? Well, there are two things. First of all, does he think we can do anything? If it's a fait accompli, if there's no resistance, there's no hope, right? You're not going to get involved. Trump likes winners. He wants to be on the winning side. And the other thing he's going to think about is, how does this make me look? So it is very important how Trump thinks this is going. If this makes him look weak, he does not like looking weak. If it makes him not look virile, then he might be willing to let Taiwan go. I see that as a very real possibility. If, however, the people around him and the people he pays attention to Fox News, he pays attention to the New York Times, even though he calls them fake news, right? They're traitors to the American people. He pays attention to that. If he thinks that this is going to make him look weak, then he will probably intervene in some way. And the US military and his advisors have a whole range of ideas about how we could do that. And then we will have a response. That's what I think would happen.
Yeah. So Trump's presidency actually changed the US grand strategy, correct?
Well, I would now, here we get, grand strategies on a certain level change all the time. Every government has a new policy. But to what extent, now this is the question we have to ask. I mean, Trump is having an impact. He has some limits on his power, even though he seems very powerful. And all the people around him, kowtow, we've learned from Chinese, they bow down to him. Yeah, kowtow. Thank you. All right, I'll have to learn to pronounce it later. But in any case, they all are bowing down to Trump. But then the question is what happens when Trump leaves. Yeah. And so and again, we don't know. It's very hard to, as one American commentator, Yogi Berra, who was a baseball coach, he says, it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. What we can say, and this goes back to what you were asking me earlier, there are different tendencies in the Trump administration who are going to try to vie, right? Who are going to try to define American grand strategy. And over time, by the way, things will change. But there's still one scenario, is we see a restoration, a return, the Marco Rubios, or let's say a more traditional American, right, Democrat comes into the presidency, takes power, and they go back to something more like the old American grand strategy. It's not possible to do this entirely, by the way. All our allies now know that it's possible that this will happen again. Yeah. So there, I'm sure the Europeans are going to, I know the Europeans are now beginning to prepare, though they don't like to say it, a plan B. They're going to try to increase their ability to operate without the United States, build up their defense industry, build up an alternative. The Japanese, the Koreans have to think the same way. And frankly, I think in Taiwan, you have to think about that as a possibility too. But still, there's the possibility that there will be a return to something more like the grand American strategy.
And they are like the most manageable or most predictable group of people.
For you.
For us.
I mean, I think there's some people, they're dangerous. Yeah. I mean, we have been heading into a strategic competition with China now for quite a few years. Henry Kissinger already over a decade ago, our former Secretary of State, he says, we are now in the foothills of a new Cold War with China. That was 10 years ago. We're now we're climbing the mountains. Yeah, and that's a scary thing. And just because the first Cold War went well doesn't mean a second Cold War will go well either. Yeah. So we don't want that necessarily. But that's one, right? That's one plausible scenario. And certainly, by the way, if you listen to some people, many people in the US Congress, many people in academy, scholars, think tank, the US military, to the extent that they can talk, the poor people, they're not getting fired by Pete Hegseth. Diplomats, they think that way. American public opinion, by the way, it's very funny. Trump comes in, he says, no more, forever wars. American public opinion says, yeah, no more forever wars. They all like that idea. But on the other hand, if you ask them, how do you feel about U.S. alliances? Should we support U.S. alliances? The number of people who support U.S. alliances, this also happened in the first Trump administration. You look at public opinion data, it's going up. So American public still, I think, has subconsciously some instincts which reflect the old American grand strategy. So that's real. I would not be surprised. Another group is
you mean the neo-isolation?
The neo-isolationists, the MAGA types. And there are some of the younger Republicans, like Josh Hawley. They think that way. They're trying to create a new network of scholars and of think tanks who support these ideas, who believe that the United States should pull back, that we are overextended. And I'm just talking about the American debate. I won't talk about the reality of the world. I think they're wrong, but they have an argument. And the longer, by the way, this chaos goes on, the more our allies will have to say, this grand strategy depended not only on the United States, it depended on our allies. We could not have done this unless other countries like Japan, like Germany, like South Korea, like Great Britain, even France, sort of, maybe, kind of, if they didn't say, we want you to play this role, it wouldn't have happened. The longer this alienation goes on, the more they feel betrayed, the more it will not be possible to restore that system.
So it sounds like if this group of people get power, it's the most tragic for the international community.
Well, for Taiwan.
For Taiwan.
Right? It will be that will be a
nightmare.
That would be a nightmare. I think you would be under great pressure to accommodate Beijing.
But which is the most likely scenario?
Well, there's one more scenario, which is, I'm afraid, volatility. That is, unfortunately, because I'm concerned that the forces which created Donald Trump are still there. We still have inequality. We still have lots of Americans, as with many other countries in the advanced industrial world, who feel dissatisfied with the system and who will turn to some alternative set, of people, whether they're on the left or the right, whether they're Zoran Mondani in New York, or they're or Bernie Sanders, though he's too old, from Vermont, or Alexandria Octavia-Cortez from Brooklyn, comes from my Boston University. She's a populist, left-wing populist. That would be one alternative. They're also quite isolationist, by the way. And I've been talking about the right-wing isolationists, but the left-wing isolationists also feel that we should pull back. Or they will turn to some neo-Trump figure, somebody who promises the same set of things like Trump, even if they're not quite as crazy as Trump. And then and if you don't solve these problems, or you may have a restorationist, which I think is more likely in the short run. You have somebody who comes in, let's say a Democratic president, like Joe Biden, goes back. Kamala Harris would have, if she had won the election, she would have been more like this. She would have come back in, she would have continued Joe Biden's policies, but she would not have addressed many of the forces, the issues which are creating this dissatisfaction. And so what you will get, as I'm afraid is the most likely, is you're going to have moving back and forth. It's neither abandon Taiwan, nor returning to a more traditional American strategy, which emphasizes what you're going to see now, I think, for the next 10 years. Because I may be wrong. I hope that some political figure will emerge who will have a solution, a charismatic person, he, she, whoever they are, who is able to, in a convincing way, address this. But I don't see that right now. And so I'm afraid what you're faced is some kind of, maybe not as extreme as under Trump, but some kind of continued uncertainty.
So given all these uncertainties in the coming years, what should Taiwan do? Any lesson, or is there any lesson from other countries that you could tell us?
There are two things I would say. First of all, you still have to think about Trump for at least 2 more years, 2.5 more years. And so I would say it's very important for Taiwan to reach out to people in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, to people in the journalistic world, people who work not only for, let's say, ABC or CNN but also for Fox News, to scholars, to make sure that when a crisis happens, it's framed in a way that emphasizes that this involves not only your American strategic values. Trump doesn't care about it. And the values, not only values, it's also, this is a test of him. So that he understands the situation as a test of his credibility to his MAGA base and to the American public. That's one thing. So it's short term. Longer term, and again, I think we talked a little bit about this before, and I hope, and please, you have to stop me if I repeat myself. Old professors repeat themselves. But the other thing is, Taiwan, as you said, are there lessons you can look at other cases? Taiwan's not the first small country to face seemingly overwhelming threats. I gave a book to Lung Yingtai, about a very good book about small states during before this and after, during the Second World War. Countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, who had to deal with World War II. Imagine being Sweden. Imagine being Switzerland, right? Or Finland, stuck between the Soviet Union and the Allied powers and the Third Reich, all of whom are potentially hostile towards you, and all of whom are threatening you. And some of those countries failed. They were invaded. They were for a while wiped off the map. Norway suffered that fate. And some countries managed to survive the storm of 1938 to 1947, not just World War II, but the period after it, before it and after it. There were three things which were important for them. Okay. One is they had political unity. You need to have some kind of consensus. You have to have, come together and say, we have to work together in meeting this threat. If you are divided, it will be very difficult to have a rational strategy. You can have dissent. You should have dissent. You should have vigorous debate. You're a democracy, and that's a strength. But you have to come to some kind of consensus about how to act. Secondly, you do need to be able to defend yourself. If you're not able to defend yourself, a ruthless government like the Soviet Union, like Nazi Germany, and even, by the way, during World War II, the Western Allied powers also became quite ruthless. They felt they were in a life and death struggle, and they were willing to do some not very nice things. They will take whatever is given to them or offered to them. And the third thing, which is also very important, it's not, again, goals are intention. There's no simple solution, and especially for a small country. You have to engage your potential enemies. If you do not talk to them, they have a cost-benefit analysis. What are the costs and risks if I do something? What are the benefits if I don't do something? You have to be able to do this. Let me take a negative case. Don't be Norway. Norway's a wonderful country. It was a decent country before World War II. What they did is they were very slow to mobilize. They did not build up their defenses. They were in complete disarray. And they also they wanted to have a moral position. Strict neutrality. Nobody should interfere with us. We will not help anybody. Well, Nazi Germany said, we want iron from you. We want to have transit rights through your waters. We want to have bases, in that Norwegian case, because they were dealing with Great Britain. Norway said, no, that violates our neutrality. The Norwegians believed that the British would come and rescue them if the Nazis invaded. Well, the Nazis decided, we're going to show you. They invaded. They overwhelmed the Norwegian defenses. The British intervened. They did not do it as strongly or sufficiently to stop them, and Norway disappeared from the map. So that's a bad example. Sweden, right next to Norway, also a neutral country, built up their defenses. They invested in fortifications. They mobilized. They were like Finland, another country, said, if you come, there's going to be a cost. It's going to be a high cost. And at the same time, however, they also made deals with the Nazis. They said, we're neutral, but we will trade with you. Very important in those days, an industrial resource was ball bearings, what you use for machine tools and for many weapon systems, tanks, artillery, submarines. 50% of the German ball bearings during World War II came from Sweden. The British were furious. They wanted them to cut off the German ball bearings, stop them from having this. The Swedes said, no, we can't do that. We'll trade with you too, but we will trade with the Germans. Yeah. They made themselves useful, even while they maintained them. Now, every country, right? And they actually managed to avoid getting pulled into the war, and they survived. It was because they had a clear strategy. There was a consensus. It was a strategy which relied on a combination of deterrence and engagement. Now, every country is different. Taiwan's unique. I'm convinced after traveling around a little bit even in Taiwan, it is unique in many ways, in good ways that I've seen so far. Yeah. And every situation is different. China is not the Third Reich, thank goodness. It's not Soviet Union even. But it is, but there are lessons to be learned from countries which in the past have faced this. And I would, if I were, you in the end are the only ones who understand and are able to do this. But I would try to build a consensus and try to have a balanced policy, a grand strategy for Taiwan, which helps you maneuver this very difficult situation you're in.
Yeah, it's a really good point that we should keep interacting with our strongest enemy and to, you said, make ourselves useful, or at least we can play on the table to play cards with them.
I mean, I think you've tried to do some of this before, but and Americans, if I were in the U.S. government, I couldn't say some of these things, right? I would say, of course we'll come, or whatever I would say, right? But I think the realistic thing is that this is you do have to also be independent of the United States. Mm-hmm. That is tremendously important.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe our time for the panel is up, but I would like to hear from you that whether you have any question you want to raise, and if you don't agree with Professor Berger, you can also state your own idea.
We want vigorous dispute.
Yeah, straight, rigorous questions. Anyone who wants to go first? Please.
Generally, and Mary first.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Berger. We really learned a lot today. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Actually, I have a lot of questions.
Well, please.
But I try to shorten my my expression for my question. That's the United States commitments really matters in Taiwan's security and defense. Some people maybe said that we should strengthen our self-defense, but it doesn't work when we face such as like China. So the commitments of the United States always matter to us. Mm. But the problem is that how can we do? How Taiwan should do to make itself strategically indispensable to the United States. Mm-hmm. You provide kind of a very traditional way that's make Taiwan become a partner that the United States simply just will not walk away from. Mm-hmm. But the problem is how should we do? Besides that kind of lobby of this kind of a traditional way. Mm-hmm. So when Taiwan is a small state, when faced the great power competition, probably we can choose a strategy of the partnership, or playing a kind of pivotal role, or playing kind of a hedging strategy. What do you think? Of course, nowadays Taiwan is playing the kind of a partnership strategy without doubt, any doubt. But how about if Taiwan change our strategy to play in the kind of a hedging strategy? That means that we can simultaneously interact with the United States and mainland China, trying to gain our interest, gain our security through this kind of very complicated interaction among the United States, China, and Taiwan. What is your view about that?
Well, I want to learn from you, and you as a military man understand much better than I do what the realities are. Well, first of all, I mean, I think in terms of deterrence is going to be part of the strategy. There's some very difficult questions you have to ask because, as we see what kind of weapon systems, you, I think, have been talking about asymmetry. I mean, we look again, warfare is changing. There are military technical questions about how one does this best. We're watching both in the United States is happy to watch the problems Russia is having with drones and automated vehicles in Ukraine. We're not so happy to watch what's happening for us, right, in the Straits of Hormuz and the Iranian contingency. But warfare is changing. And in some ways, there are abilities for the weaker state to make things very, very difficult for the more powerful state. There are ways that Taiwan on the conventional level can deter China. And, my friends, and I talk to military men like yourself in the US and in other parts of Asia. Invading Taiwan is really hard. And if the US, you have to have the first line of defense. But if the United States intervenes at this point in time, and I think for a while, it will be very difficult for China to succeed at an acceptable cost. The big problem will be to stop escalation. That is, when the war games would be, look, how do we stop this from getting out of control? There will be, we have, and as you know better than I, we have military plans which involve escalation from our side. That is blockading China, doing a counter blockade, attacking Chinese bases, air-sea battle 2025, those kinds of things. And that could become complete. And then we also have to be concerned about escalation from the Chinese side. One US admiral said, it's very easy to imagine how a war with China starts. It's hard to imagine how it ends. So these are difficult questions. The other thing is that, however, and this is where, one, it's not a question of, I like to think that we need to think about not just either or, that is 100% of the United States or 100% of China. I think some kind of hedging is needed. And the US needs to understand that hedging is needed. We of course want our allies to follow us 100%, but that is not going to work. China, Taiwan might, and now again, I am speaking as an ignorant person, an irresponsible scholar who does not understand these things the way you who are here in the situation understand it. But China wants not ball bearings, but they want semiconductors. China wants some guarantee that Taiwan does not become a US military base or an important platform for military operations against China. The Chinese feel that the US has encircled them and is in fact trying to encircle them more with the help of our allies and partners in the region. If Taiwan can reassure China on that score, and the US will, of course, complain, but sometimes, friends have to tell friends, back off. We need the space. You need that space. And if the US is wise, we need to understand that. And I think we would, I hope. Maybe under a different administration, which is smarter and more coherent. Does that, and I wish I could say more, because it's an excellent question and one that I hope you can help answer.
Would you like to add on something else? Oh.
More time is
We'll follow up.
I have a dinner time with this.
Okay. So we have time for one more question. Is there anyone interested in?
Okay, I should work there.
Thank you, Mr. Professor, for your very candid and straightforward reminder for all of us in this room. And my question is that you might already heard that I think since Prime Minister Takaichi took office in last autumn, and it seems quite apparently that the President Lai and his administration in Taiwan are feel very much encouraged due to the realignment about their ideological stances and their almost the same historical context and the same very high degrees of the prudence towards the potential aggressions of the PRC. So we have seen that strong tendency that after the Takaichi Prime Minister's statement on Taiwan as the potential Taiwan contingency, perhaps I think launching the administration here would like to build up a kind of what I call the arc of security alliances or security burden sharing between Taiwan and Japan, and they want to use this architecture to better deter the potential aggressions from PRC. At the same time, I think the current LDP leadership in Japan also consciously to use the escalating Taiwan scenario, escalating Taiwan's heated water here to justify their agenda for either further amended the constitution to normalize Japan or to equip Japan with a higher degrees of the military preparedness for a Taiwan contingency. So it seems like the two governments or the two leaders want to meet in halfway and to make the non-official military alliance to be gradually emerged across the two places. But my question is that would this architecture of the security arc between Taiwan and Japan, will it really usefully to deter Beijing, or conversely, it might even speed up Beijing's anxiety and the preparedness to take actions? Because as we all know that maybe the cross-strait dilemma, cross-strait paradox is one thing. But if the differences and the divergence between the two, between Taiwan and China are kind of somehow intervened by the Chinese side's historical complex and the hatred, maybe we can strategic hatred towards Japan. If though these factors all mingle together,
well, I think,
will it be a wise approach?
I began working on these issues 40 years ago. So if I start talking about this, right, I won't stop. So I try to discipline myself. I think you're correct that conservatives in Japan have been wanting for a long time to use security issues to also affect changes, including beginning with changing the Japanese constitution. Prime Minister Takaichi is very much a conservative, and she wants to change the constitution. She wants to revive what she thinks is a healthy patriotism. She feels the Japanese have lost themselves as a nation. And she believes that, understanding that Japan needs to stand up is part of, right, that approach. I do not think even Takaichi thinks that Japan can substitute for the United States. When she made her statements, she made a couple of statements a few months ago, she was thinking very much about what Japan would do if there was a contingency involving the United States. That is, if there was a contingency, a scenario, a military situation developing around Taiwan, the United States decided to intervene. She understood, which is correct, that it would be impossible for Japan to not get involved. And she wanted to say quite clearly that if that happens, this is legally the kind of situation where the Japanese military will have to support, right, some kind of operation. She did not make clear what it would be. We in the United States, when we do wargaming, when we think about what would happen in that scenario, Japan becomes absolutely vital. For a long time, for decades, by the way, some of my friends in the Japanese government, they said, we don't even want to talk about this, okay? This is the thing which we do not want to talk about. Partly because what you just said, China is, for good reason, historically, very sensitive to any Japanese involvement, especially on Taiwan issue. If you want to drive the Chinese crazy, having Japan come and say it's going to, defend Taiwan is a good way to do that. Yeah. So I think, Takaichi understands that. I think her advisors understand that. She is like her advisor, who was also, her mentor, Abe Shinzo, the previous prime minister. She is very conservative. She's pro-defense, ideological, but she is also a pragmatist. I think she would not want to try to play that role. It is very important for Japan to work with the United States. and other countries to think about how it supports US if this kind of scenario happens in a way that does not create exactly what you're saying. So it creates what the Japanese call gyakoka, a counterproductive reaction. And I think that that's, if you have a restorationist scenario, that is, we go back to a traditional grand strategy, we would continue to move in that direction. And Japan would play absolutely vital role. Without Japan, US policymakers have understood for the last 20 years, right? It's interesting. As Japan has gotten weaker, in many ways, it's become more important, precisely because China is becoming more central to American foreign policy. And without Japan, we can't do it. So that's my answer to your question.
So we still have time for another question.
I think we have another
Mr.
question
Schubert,
back here.
You have a question, right?
There's still time.
Yeah, there's still time.
Thank you very much. I came a little bit late, so I couldn't listen to your talk at the beginning. But I have two questions for you. You framed the isolationists in the United States as the bad people, if I understood correctly. I wonder if a little bit of isolationism wouldn't be very good for the United States. I cannot really see why that should be so negative. I mean, there is in Europe, there's a whole discussion about imperial overstretch and the difficulties that are entailed by this. But then it depends, of course, on how you define isolationism. So my question in brief is, how would you define isolationism in contemporary times? And wouldn't that really be bad for the United States? Also, given the fact that you would save a lot of money that you would spend in domestic politics, where the structural problems of American democracy are probably situated, and that would be very helpful for the long-term sustainability of that democracy. That's my first question. Sure. Second question is, what we found extremely amazing in Europe, I'm from Germany, was how Donald Trump could hijack political institutions in the United States and how little pushback there was. Now we see there is more pushback now, but the question still holds, what have you learned personally about your own political system? Is this a resilient democracy, or is this a democracy that can be easily done away with if you have somebody like Donald Trump and maybe a couple of others who would be as crazy as he is, so that they would systematically work against those institutions and destroy them over time? This is a real question. We have lost it. We have lost faith in American democracy, but we wonder how resilient that democracy really is. I mean, you can imagine of other guys than Donald Trump who are not so, transactional, but who come with an ideology, like we had in Germany. The very big difference between him and Donald Trump, he had an ideology that he put into action. Donald Trump has no ideology to our best perception. So what do you think about those institutions? Are they strong enough? The third point is a comment. You just said about Europe that now they have a plan B. No, we get a plan A. I think America has completely played away its trust in Europe, even if there are some older transatlanticists, like in Germany as well. But this is a dying generation, and the next generation that comes will do what it can to get ready in Europe. And if the Americans come in and help, that's fine, but we cannot rely on them anymore. That's, I think, is going to be the mainstream in a European thinking now in the immediate future.
We can continue the third point a little later, but I'll focus on one and two. One, I mean, look, this argument that the United States is imperial overstretch, right? That, again, it's the finance department. You're spending way too much on this. You're living beyond your means. It's time to pull back. You may be, maybe. It's very hard to figure out what the balance of power is, because there's so many different things which play into it. And it's very hard to, again, predict the future. Do we have the means? The United States by itself, maybe. The United States with its allies, with its friends and partners, still represents close to 50% of global GDP. Right? So we now have to engage in partly a balance of power analysis. China is growing. It's growing a lot slower than it used to. That will only increase in time. Part of the Chinese economy is taking off. There are lots of smart guys I've met from Tsinghua and other places who are coming up with new technologies. There's lots of smart entrepreneurs, but China has at least two problems. One, of course, is that the political system has been really making it hard for China to grow. If China didn't have that political system, China might well be the dominant world power in the world today. It screwed itself up. Russia is far worse. And then you've got also the demographic reality. Yeah, I mean, China is aging, and it's aging. I mean, Taiwan is aging. Japan is already long on the way. China, as they say, is getting old fast before it's gotten rich. China has to really need to go back, in my view. And some Chinese economists I talked to say to me, China should be focusing on helping its people, moving to a consumption-based economy, not investing so much in overseas adventures. Yeah, it's always a balance of power is always relative. Okay. And I think, how is the balance of power shifting? I'm not sure it's shifting against the United States and its partners, especially if the partners help us, and maybe we can expand the circle of partners to resist it. Now, what would happen if we did pull back and focus on our own affairs? And then, people often say China, if it gets Taiwan, that's it. Okay. And if Russia can recreate something like the old Tsarist empire minus Poland, they'll be okay too. Okay, I'm not sure about that.
This is not one of the isolations. There are very different ways of how you can become an isolationist. You can think you are responsible of many things, of most things, of few things, and you have the power to define where you look at and where you don't look at. This is just a matter of degree. It's not a matter of I'm an isolationist or...
No, of course. And if you listen to the folks who make those arguments, and some of my former colleague, Andy Basovich, is the head of the Quincy Institute, and I respect him a great deal, but they would make exactly that argument, right? And that isolationism has got a bad name, and it doesn't mean withdraw from world affairs. Barry Posen, who I used to study with at MIT, restraint, I mean, I could go on about this. I know this argument, yeah, and they argue that we can pull back. But you have to assume that there are going to be conflicts will, or only limited number of conflicts will break out, that once Russia swallows Ukraine or the eastern Donbas region, once China gets Taiwan, that's going to be it. I don't think that's necessarily going to be what's going to happen. Yeah. I mean, China will want, for example, Japan to neutralize. China wants hold of Arunachal Pradesh in India. I mean, they have an expanding set of interests which could get into a lot of conflicts. We could try to stay out of them. They may explode, and we may wind up being pulled back into this. I am still, maybe it's my generation. Maybe I'm overly affected by the World War II. Maybe they will not, but it's a big risk. And then we would be relearning the lessons that we learned from the first half of the 20th century, and which had such devastating consequences.
Yeah. You were just saying that you didn't want to be the world police.
Well, we're not. I mean,
precisely the world police thinking.
Well, world police.
Is trying to police everything.
Well, we're not going to get involved in Sudan. We're not getting involved in Congo.
We should. You're overreach.
Yeah, well, and maybe we are overreaching, and maybe we need to have if you want to.
Why do you want to police the world?
Because again.
Because you have this what the scholar of Holy War uses the term aggressive self-righteousness.
Well, I mean, there are lots of Americans.
The American grand strategy.
Well, I mean, we believe in the superiority of our system in the long run, but I think the first reason, which is why I begin with the lessons of what we think are the lessons of history. Maybe they're completely wrong. Maybe this is a mask for capitalist interests who are armed salesmen or out of control nationalism or whatever it is, or the American messianic spirit, and that this is all a mask.
I have a quick question. I'm sorry to.
Oh, okay, sure. American democracy can wait.
I think it's a greater cause of global instability of Israel or China. But it looks like Israel is a much bigger cause of global instability.
Well, right now at this moment, Israel is called, I mean, I'm no fan of the Netanyahu government. I do not think that this is what they're doing in Palestine is a good thing. And I am deeply unhappy, as are many other Americans, with how Israel managed to pull us into this stupid war with Iran. Okay, so Israel.
Just the Netanyahu government.
No.
The Israel itself.
Well, hang on, by the way, let me just say one thing. One thing you better remember. If we were to say, goodbye, Israel, you're on your own, and half of the Israeli population will leave, and they will emigrate to Europe and the US and elsewhere. And what will be left are a bunch of very rigidly ideological, right, ultra-Zionists with nuclear weapons. You will have a Zionist North Korea with no influence from the US. If you want to have a nuclear war, one of the highest chances of that happening is in that scenario. The Turks will have to get nuclear weapons. The Iranians will continue to do this way. Israel say we'll have to have a preemptive strike. It would be a screeching nightmare. So I do not think that isolating Israel would be a good idea.
The problem of Israel, not necessarily just following their hidden agenda. The U.S. government has for a long time been just following the Israeli agenda rather than like negotiating.
I'm here to talk about East Asia, not the Middle East. No, but look, I simply will say I'm not a fan of this. But let me just finish what I was going to say. If we have a scenario involving Taiwan, if we have a sequence of wars involving, right, this will make what's happening in the Middle East look small. If you want to talk about the tectonic plates of global politics, where it's crashing up, where you can have volcanic eruptions that expand, East Asia is far more dangerous.
Yeah.
And then
this will be our last question.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Sorry.
Berger.
Sorry to go on.
Thank you, Mr. Liao. And yeah, it's been an incredible session and really brilliant Q&As. I've learned a lot myself, and I hope you all learn from this. And yeah, we just took a deep look into Washington's messy internal politics and what impact it will bring to Taiwan, and most importantly, what we could do here at this small island. How do we survive? How do we play for more time for ourselves? And yeah, let's give a huge round of applause to Professor Thomas Berger for his brilliant insights.
Thank you, and thank you all for the good questions.
And a big thank you to the Long Tai Cultural Foundation for putting this together. And to everyone here in the hall and joining us online, thank you for being such an amazing audience. And if you're watching this on YouTube, if you love today's talk, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video to your friends. And thank you, stay resilient, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.